Imagine it's late 1944 on the Western Front. German officers huddle over maps in freezing command bunkers, reviewing reports from the front lines, their faces grim. Across France, the battlefield is a storm of noise and chaos. They have fought the British experienced, disciplined, and precise, but now they face something far more terrifying: American soldiers. Unlike the cautious, methodical British units, the Americans arrive with an unstoppable combination of firepower, speed, and sheer numbers. Tanks rumble across the fields in waves, artillery pounds relentlessly, and fighter-bombers sweep the skies, leaving no place to hide. German soldiers are caught off guard by the Americans' aggressive tactics: semi-automatic rifles blazing, machine guns laying down suppressive fire, and squads advancing with relentless energy. It's not just the weapons. They are fighting a force that adapts quickly, learns from its mistakes, and returns stronger after every setback. The psychological impact is immense. These soldiers seem almost inexhaustible, and their industrial-backed war machine ensures that they are never truly outnumbered or outgunned. In the eyes of the Germans, the British were dangerous and professional, but predictable. The Americans were something else entirely: a shock, a juggernaut, a terrifying force that combined human determination with an overwhelming material advantage. What exactly made these ordinary men so fearsome? And why did German commanders privately admit that facing the Americans was more daunting than facing the seasoned British? This is the untold story of how America's soldiers, their tactics, and the industrial power behind them struck fear into the hearts of Germany, reshaping the battlefield in ways that would change the course of the war forever. By the time World War II reached its peak in 1944, Germany had already faced some of the most formidable armies in history. They had tested their mettle against the French, overran Poland, and clashed with the British Expeditionary Force in France, learning to respect the professionalism and discipline of Britain's long military tradition. The British soldier was methodical, cautious, and trained to endure the harsh realities of war with steady resolve. Yet when the Americans arrived on European soil, the Germans encountered a very different kind of soldier, one who defied their expectations at every turn. Initially, many German officers assumed these Yankees would be untested, inexperienced, and overly reliant on their machines, a perception born of prejudice against the new, citizen-based army. But those assumptions quickly shattered during early encounters in North Africa, Sicily, and eventually Normandy. Unlike the British, American forces were backed by an industrial behemoth, capable of flooding the front with endless tanks, artillery, trucks, and ammunition. They fought with a mix of aggressive tactics, semi-automatic firepower, and relentless adaptability that was both shocking and intimidating to German soldiers hardened by years of warfare. It wasn't just their weapons that made them dangerous, it was their mentality. American soldiers seemed fearless, resilient, and willing to attack with overwhelming force, often showing an uncanny ability to recover from setbacks and push forward. Germany's experienced generals, who had faced Britain's elite troops with confidence, soon discovered that the Americans brought a combination of scale, speed, and unpredictability that was uniquely terrifying, forcing Germany to rethink its strategies on the battlefield and giving the Allies a psychological, as well as a material edge that would prove decisive in the war's final chapters. When German commanders first faced American forces, one thing became immediately clear: they were fighting more than soldiers, they were fighting an entire industrial machine. Unlike the British, who had fought wars with limited resources and relied heavily on experience and tactical efficiency, the Americans brought the full weight of their nation's production might to the battlefield. By 1944, the United States had transformed its economy to meet the demands of global war. Factories in Detroit, Chicago, and Toledo churned out thousands of tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and planes every month. The Sherman tanks, although not individually superior to German Panthers or Tigers, appeared in overwhelming numbers, rolling across fields in waves that German defenses could barely stop. Trucks carried endless supplies of ammunition, food, and reinforcements, ensuring that American units rarely ran low. For German soldiers, this was both bewildering and terrifying. They had been trained to wear down their enemy through attrition, relied on careful planning and concentrated strikes. The Americans did not play by these rules. They could absorb losses, regroup, and return with fresh units in a matter of days. German generals recorded their shock in reports. The Americans were inexhaustible, their strength replenished by an industrial heartland that seemed untouchable. Even when a German unit destroyed a company of Sherman tanks or cut off an infantry squad, another would appear within hours. This constant pressure was psychologically exhausting. The British could be respected, feared even, But the Americans brought an unrelenting tide of men and machines that never seemed to stop, a force whose sheer scale broke German expectations and forced them to fight differently than they had ever fought before. Fighting Americans was not just a tactical challenge, it was a war of endurance against a nation capable of producing victory in bulk. German soldiers quickly learned that American artillery was not just support, it was a weapon in its own right, capable of shattering morale before a single shot was fired. American artillery units were meticulously trained to coordinate fire with astonishing speed. Forward observers could call down a barrage in minutes, and the use of radios ensured that fire missions hit their targets with frightening precision. One of the most terrifying techniques was time on target, where multiple batteries fired, so that all shells struck at the same moment, leaving no shelter for the Germans. By late 1944, the introduction of proximity fuses only amplified the devastation, with high explosive shells detonating in midair, raining shrapnel over entire defensive positions. Germans noted the psychological effect. American artillery did not merely destroy, it terrorized. Infantry advancing under such barrages felt exposed and helpless, and defensive positions were flattened with a speed that made resistance seem futile. While the British also had powerful artillery, it was often used more methodically, focused on careful preparation and sustained bombardment. Americans, by contrast, struck hard and fast, combining speed, volume, and unpredictability. In Normandy, the hedgerows became death traps for German defenders, as American guns relentlessly pounded them from multiple directions, often coordinated with airstrikes and infantry assaults. The sheer precision and timing made it feel as if the Americans could see into the battlefield itself. German soldiers later admitted that before they saw an American infantryman, they already felt the artillery striking around them. This combination of firepower, coordination, and psychological impact made American artillery a superweapon in the eyes of German troops. It wasn't merely physical destruction that frightened them. It was the knowledge that wherever they were, a relentless barrage could appear, and there would be no escape. By 1944, control of the skies had become a decisive factor in warfare, and the Americans, alongside the British, attaquaient near totalaire supremacy over Western Europe. But it was the American approach that particularly unnerved German troops. Fighter bombers roamed the skies relentlessly, striking columns of tanks, trucks, and troops whenever they were exposed. For the Germans, this meant that daylight movement became almost suicidal. Logistics, normally the lifeblood of any army, were constantly harassed from above, with resupply convoys cut off and reinforcements delayed. The psychological impact was profound. German soldiers, trained to fight on the ground and in the air, could do little to counter the Americans' combined arms strategy. Unlike the British, whose air attacks were often strategic and limited to carefully chosen targets, American air power was tactical, integrated into every offensive operation. Bombers and fighter bombers struck in coordination with artillery and infantry, creating a battlefield where the enemy could feel pressure from every direction simultaneously. The Germans described this as fighting in a storm, where the air itself seemed hostile. Even the most experienced veterans found themselves unnerved by the constant roar of aircraft overhead and the unpredictability of attacks. This domination of the skies amplified every other aspect of American power. Infantry assaults were safer, artillery strikes were more effective, and German defenses were constantly disrupted. By combining air power with overwhelming material and tactical advantage, American forces created a sense of inevitability that the Germans could neither ignore nor counter. The sky was no longer neutral. Territoriate was a lethal, omnipresent threat that made every move on the ground a gamble with death. The Americans' infantry approach was unlike anything many German soldiers had faced, whereas the British often emphasized measured attacks and defensive consolidation. American squads advanced aggressively, using the sheer firepower at their disposal to dominate the battlefield. Each squad was a concentrated force of semi-automatic rifles, Browning automatic rifles, and machine guns. Individual soldiers could lay down suppressive fire that allowed their comrades to maneuver, while small unit leaders had the autonomy to make tactical decisions on the spot. This combination of firepower and flexibility shocked German troops, who were accustomed to slower, more disciplined advances. Americans also rarely conserved ammunition when it mattered most. They attacked with overwhelming force, preferring to dominate with fire rather than maneuver cautiously. In the hedgerows of Normandy, or the forests of the Ardennes, this approach proved devastating. German defensive positions were often overrun, not because of strategy alone, but because they could not withstand the volume and precision of American fire. Beyond weapons, the Americans were unpredictable. Their junior leaders took initiative, altered plans on the fly, and exploited weaknesses instantly. German commanders quickly learned that an American unit would not just attack once and retreat, it would regroup, reinforce, and attack again, often in unexpected directions. The combination of aggressive tactics, relentless firepower, and adaptive leadership made the Americans a nightmare to face in close combat, amplifying the impact of artillery and air support, and leaving German units struggling to respond effectively. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of American soldiers to the Germans was their mentality. These were citizen soldiers, drawn from factories, farms, and small towns, yet transformed into an unstoppable force through training, morale, and belief in victory. Unlike German units, which often became exhausted after prolonged campaigns, Americans rotated fresh divisions into the front, keeping pressure constant. Their willingness to fight, recover from setbacks, and push forward with relentless determination defied German expectations. Cultural differences played a role as well. Junior officers and non-commissioned leaders were empowered to act decisively, making the army agile and responsive on a scale that surprised seasoned German commanders. The Germans, used to highly disciplined but more rigid forces, found themselves reacting to American innovation on the battlefield, from improvised tactics to daring assaults under fire. This adaptability, combined with material superiority, air support, and overwhelming firepower, made facing Americans psychologically and tactically exhausting. Veterans recalled that once the Americans attacked, there was no predictable pattern, only relentless pressure that seemed impossible to escape. By the time Germany understood the full weight of the American approach, it was often too late. The combination of industrial power, artillery, air supremacy, aggressive tactics, and indomitable mentality created a force that German soldiers, even at their most confident, considered more terrifying than the disciplined, experienced British troops they had faced for decades. Even as German soldiers feared the Americans, they also respected the British for their experience, discipline, and professionalism. The British Army had centuries of military tradition behind it, with officers and troops who had faced war in multiple theaters and honed their skills through hard experience. Their approach was methodical and deliberate. Attacks were carefully planned, defenses well prepared, and logistics managed to sustain long campaigns. Germans often described the British as competent, steady, and unflinching in battle, but also predictable. They would fight with skill, but within established patterns and tactics, making it possible for German commanders to anticipate moves, prepare countermeasures, and exploit timing. By contrast, the Americans brought a combination of unpredictability, aggression, and overwhelming scale that broke these patterns. The British rarely advanced with the sheer relentless pressure of American units, and they were more cautious in the use of their limited manpower and resources. Their attacks were disciplined, but slower, calculated, and often defensive-minded after initial offensives. German troops noted that while the British could be dangerous, they could also be outmaneuvered or exhausted over time, allowing Germany to fight on familiar terms. The Americans, however, operated differently. They hit hard and fast, coordinated attacks across infantry, artillery, and air support, and leveraged massive production to ensure that losses were quickly replaced. Even when setbacks occurred, American units bounced back with fresh troops and renewed supplies. In essence, the British represented a professional, well-trained opponent, but one that could be measured and countered. The Americans represented escalation on a scale Germany had not yet faced. Speed, firepower, adaptability, and unrelenting pressure that created a psychological edge, in addition to the physical threat. German commanders quickly realized that defeating the British required skill and patience, but defeating the Americans required a war of endurance, against a force whose size, tactics, and industrial backing made resistance feel almost futile. This contrast highlights why, despite British it was the Americans who became a truly terrifying presence on the Western Front. By the end of the war, Germany had faced some of the most formidable armies in history, yet it was the Americans who left the deepest mark on both their strategy and their psyche. The British had been respected, feared even, for their professionalism and experience, but they fought with a predictable, measured approach that allowed German commanders to anticipate and counter them. The Americans were different. They brought an overwhelming combination of industrial might, relentless artillery, and air supremacy that never gave the enemy a moment's respite. Their infantry advanced aggressively, wielding superior firepower and adaptive tactics that turned every engagement into a high-pressure trial of survival. Beyond equipment and strategy, it was the American mentality, resourceful and willing to recover quickly from setbacks, that truly unnerved the German army. They were not merely soldiers. They were the embodiment of a nation's full-scale war effort, coordinated down to the smallest unit, yet unpredictable in execution. German reports repeatedly noted that facing Americans was like fighting a tide that would not ebb, a force that combined human determination with industrial-scale power in ways that Germany could neither match nor ignore. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical threat. Fear, exhaustion, and the sense of inevitability seeped into German ranks, undermining morale even before battles began. Ultimately, what made the Americans more terrifying than the British was this synthesis of scale, speed, adaptability, and sheer resilience. They represented a new kind of warfare, industrial, aggressive, an unrelenting one that reshaped the battlefield and redefined what it meant to face an enemy army. For Germany, the lesson was stark. Experience and professionalism alone could not withstand the relentless momentum of a modern, industrialized military force that fought with both courage and overwhelming material advantage. By 1945, American soldiers were not just opponents. They were a force of nature, an unstoppable wave that carried the Allies to victory, leaving Germany to confront the full weight of a nation mobilized for war. Their legacy was clear. They changed the rules of engagement, redefined fear on the battlefield, and proved that sometimes the most terrifying weapon is not a single gun or tank, but the combination of human will and industrial power operating in perfect, unrelenting harmony.